Degsie's All-Time Runners, a short story by Janet H Swinney. Instalment 1. Degsie, don't ask, drew himself in, flattening his fur against his ribs, and squeezed through the tall privet at the top of the allotment. He'd had a good night up on the railway lines. An almost full moon had come and gone amongst billowing clouds. There had been ample opportunity for springing in and out of the shadows onto unsuspecting prey, and he'd made considerable headway into a family of voles living unobtrusively in a ditch. There'd been plenty of opportunity for sexual antics too. The grubby female with the black patch over one eye put in an appearance when the moon was high. They took a few steps around each other and then set to with a screeching that tore the neighbourhood apart. Later came the slender mackerel tabby with the pretty white feet, a lower key but equally satisfying affair. Towards the morning the moon paled and made its exit. The undergrowth became dank. A reluctant glimmer felt its way between the branches of the crippled elms. A few birds stuttered nervously in their nests. The start of another dingy autumn day. Degsie shook himself. He wanted to get indoors. He slalomed between the last of the Brussels sprout stalks and padded along one of the ridges where the potatoes had grown. He scrabbled up onto a fence post, dropped down into the lane, up onto a wheelie bin, and down into the blind woman's yard. Degsie had had many live-in arrangements over the years, but the best was the one he had now. His long smoke grey fur with the cream undertones was very high maintenance, but made him hugely attractive to humankind. A pair of pale, button-like eyes gave him an air of wide-eyed innocence that added to his appeal. Children and pensioners fell upon him with oohs and ahs, failing to notice that he was, in fact, a menacing muscle-bound meatball. For a while he had lived with Dennis, a barber who called him Choo-Choo. Life in the barber's shop could be good, snoozing all day in a sun-soaked leather chair and being cosseted by the customers. But Dennis was a bit too fond of groomings that featured latherings and unctions, and he took Choo-Choo to the vet far more often than Choo-Choo would have liked. Ultimately, Dennis developed an allergy to hair. He became so depressed that Degsie found his own mood and appetite deteriorating. So one evening, after closing, while Dennis was moping over a back number of Harpers and Queen, Degsie did a runner. Some time after that came Stephen, a small boy who hated school. Degsie made friends with Stephen on a demolition site where he was hiding to avoid number lines and vectors. He followed him home to reconnoitre. The place looked promising, so he introduced himself. There was a mother, a father and a grandmother. The mother regarded him with suspicion and made it clear he was on probation. But shortly after his arrival, Stephen stopped wetting the bed, so Degsie was allowed to stay. Things went smoothly for a while, though the atmosphere in the house was never entirely comfortable. The father would give Degsie a scoot up his furry arse with his workman's boot every now and then. The mother ignored him altogether, and Grandma individually hand-counted the pieces of go-cat into his bowl as though they were gold nuggets. But Stephen had a large room, and once he was back at school, Degsie could spend long hours lolling undisturbed on his bed. And then Stephen genuinely cared for him, so when he came home, they played together till dusk overtook them. It all went wrong during the summer holidays. The pair of them had been out all day wriggling through the undergrowth. At tea time, Stephen suddenly grew flushed and breathless. He dropped his drop scone. The doctor was summoned. By the time he came, Stephen was stretched out on the sofa and was in serious difficulty. The doctor probed beneath his shirt and placed a stethoscope on his chest. "He's having an asthma attack," he said, and looked round the assembled group, the mother, the father, the grandma, and lastly, Degsie. "For goodness sake," he said, "he's allergic to the cat. Get that thing out of here." "That blessed cat," shouted the mother. "I knew it." Degsie felt himself seized by the scruff, so tight he himself could hardly breathe, and in no time at all his paws were hitting the unforgiving surface of the yard. He could hear Stephen inside crying and choking, "No, no, let Smokey stay." So he got up on the water barrel and started wailing himself in the hope that it would make them change their minds. But it didn't. When the back doors slammed that night, he was locked out of their lives for good. Now, after careful surveillance, he had ended up in a quiet cul-de-sac where only pensioners lived. He had a distributed lifestyle, spending part of his time in the home of the blind woman and part with the woman next door. The women lived alone and never spoke to each other. Neither knew that Degsie was a resident of the other's house. All that either woman required was the occasional exchange of body heat and a bit of chest rattling that they construed as affection. Degsie was happy to oblige, for on this basis he could extend his lodging indefinitely, enjoying the comforts of both homes. As Degsie sat outside the blind woman's door, he heard an alarm bell ring. Great! That meant breakfast was on the way. The blind woman's day was entirely regulated by alarms of one kind or another. A clock radio got her out of bed at 6 in the morning. Then came a bell in the kitchen for breakfast time. An electronic peeping in the living room foretold the arrival of the district nurse, and a cuckoo clock with a daft wooden bird announced dinner time, and so on throughout the day. Next door it was an entirely different matter. There the elderly resident had a more laissez-faire approach. Sometimes the driver of the social services bus would have his mouth letterboxed to the front door at noon, bellowing, "Oh, how are Miss Thornton? We're all waiting for you," while Miss Thornton would still be deep beneath the duvet, in a fleecy suit and 2 pairs of Angora socks, clutching a packet of chocolate digestives that she'd taken to bed the night before. Degsie had concluded that it was better to start the day with the punctilious Peggy, the blind lady, and then to move round to her profligate neighbour in the early afternoon. His usual practice was to stay with Miss Thornton until the evening. Generally, he sat on her lap, while she watched the telly until that blasted programme Countdown came on. There were certain sounds that just made Degsie's claws curl, and one of them was its oft-repeated catchphrase. Beep-bar, beep-bar, pom-pom-pom-pom. Determined to avoid this, he would disappear into the hat box on top of the wardrobe, leaving only his tail out to remind her of his presence. Sometimes he would look in again on Peggy just to see if there were any kippers on the go. But just as she was an early riser, so she was an early sleeper, and if your timing was worse than hers, could be encountered manicuring her dentures. Rather than risk this, he usually just made his way up to the allotments to see what was doing in the pigeon lofts.